C'est important l'éducation aussi. Bonjour, je suis Catel. Enchantée. C'est pas grave. On commence? OK. Good afternoon, everybody. This is a working lunch, so you have to listen. Yes? Okay. Well, that works really well. It works much better than in the classroom typically, so thank you for being well behaved. My name is Catel Le Goulven. I work at INSEAD with the Hoffman Institute, where we try to integrate sustainability in business education. And we still have a lot of work to do. I'm also a member of the board of Intent, organizing this event. So Intent is an initiative that aims to promote, advocate for sustainable solutions, focusing on solutions that work for businesses, for people, and for the planet. And the way it does that is that it brings together, builds bridges, and connects the dots between ideas and people. So this is why you're all here. The topic of the conversation is nature-based solution. How many of you know what nature-based solutions are? Okay, so we're going to have lunch. Okay. And making sure that we accelerate their uptake in business. So that's really what we want to focus on. And we are going to discuss with a panel of experts, but we also need you to help us identify what are the pain points that prevent business from investing in nature, okay? So it's a working lunch, not a free lunch. We need you to help us, identify how we can push that agenda forward. Now, why nature-based solution? Yesterday was the International Biodiversity Day. Not much to celebrate. You've all seen the number. Here in beautiful Switzerland, I think that the overshoot day was 10 days ago, on 13 May. I don't mean to put my Swiss friends on the spot. In France, it was 5 May, but pretty much every Western countries have had their overshoot day passed already, which means that we're all right now eating and living on resources that should have been made available for next generations. Enjoy your lunch. I think it's important to remind ourselves, though, because I think that all of us here in the room are all convinced about that, but that's why we need your brains to see how we can accelerate change. The World Economic Forum in February published a white paper on nature and how to invest in nature for business and the finance world. They do that the way the World Economic Forum does things very nicely. They bring scientists, NGOs, governments, business investors, and they ask them to estimate what the world would look like if business were to invest in nature. And their estimation is that a nature-positive economy could generate up to 10 trillion new business value by 2030 and generate 400,000 or million, I forgot the name, a lot of jobs by 2030 as well, right? Million? Yeah. So anyway, they made the business case. I don't know the details. We can trust them. Some of you were part of that exercise. We trust you. The business case has been made. This morning we had another session on with Capital's Coalition. The framework seems to also be existing. And yet, while pretty much every company has a strategy on climate change, very few have a strategy on nature. So the intent of this conversation is to identify why and try to make progress in that direction. For this, of course, I'm delighted to welcome a fantastic panel of experts. They're all here, so if I can please invite you to join the stage and have a seat under the thunder of applause of our room. It's hot, huh? So, still, make some noise for our panelists. Thank you. Thank you for your enthusiasm on the topic. So what we're going to do is that I'm going to set the stage with them. Then you're all going to go back to conversation in your table, identify these challenges and pain points, and then we're going to bring them back in and ask them what you've identified as some of these pain points so that they can react and we can take that conversation forward. Does that work for everybody? Yeah? So that's when the food will be served. Okay, thank you, all of you. I'm taking my note because I'm going to start. It's warm. No, you all okay? You're not smiling? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, So let us start it here.
After your introduction, there's nothing to smile about.
Yes. Okay. Now listen to that. So even though if all of you know what nature-based solutions are, I just checked out the United Nations Environmental Assembly definition, and in my note, nature-based solutions are actions to protect, conserve, restore, sustainably use, and manage natural or modified terrestrial, freshwater, coastal, and marine ecosystems, which address social, economic, and environmental challenges effectively and adaptively, while simultaneously, I can do this one, providing human well-being, ecosystem services, and resilience, and biodiversity benefits. This is the official, so you can see where, we have 193 member states in the UN, so everybody has their word on, but André, you've been promoting nature-based solutions for decades. Can you tell us in layman's word what they are? How do you define them?
Well, thank you very much, Catel. Yes, you're right. When you write something on the committee, you end up with a very mixed bag of definitions. I mean, a lot of different arguments have gone into this particular one, and I can see that it makes it very difficult for the planning departments of major corporations, or perhaps even of small states, to be able to really comprehend and make that work. I think that if we really want to sort of look at this in a sort of, as you say, layman term, the easiest way to think of this is a very simple one. It's, how can we work with nature rather against it? I'll go even one step further. How can we get nature to work for us? Yeah. Not, us exploiting it and trying to use every single thing. So not an extractive economy where we use and then restitute pollution, but how can we sort of make something that works on the principle of going alongside nature? So in effect, in my vision, and that's of course an idiosyncratic definition, it's a new contract with nature. How do you use nature in a way which is mutually beneficial to humanity and to the regeneration needed to bring nature to the state in which it should be and where it can continue to develop itself in a sustainable way? So how do we achieve that sort of thing? It's an interesting concept, but I think the first thing to do is to understand, well, maybe just to come back to the old common sense. If you have a factory to build, don't build it in a creek, build it on top of a mountain, because when the rain comes, you're more likely not to be flooded. Yeah. Yeah. When I talk to my friends about nature-based solution, usually everybody tells me, we're going to plant trees. Yep. And by the way, it's a very ironical thing that, we spend 350 years of technology to destroy the planet as quickly as we can by using all sorts of technology we can think of. When you have a problem with CO2, the only solution we have at scale is to plant trees. I find that ironical, but I'm just putting that on the table. The idea that how can you integrate nature into the way you plan? For me, an example which is always top of mind is the example of water. Yeah. In particular, water in the Mediterranean, and water into one of the areas which is the cradle of humanity, where not of humanity, the cradle of European civilization, and where we have, over the years, developed a lot of alternative use of water, and where we are currently suffering a serious problem, not only on the south side of the Mediterranean, where water is urgently needed for agriculture, but also in the north side of the Mediterranean, where water is urgently needed for the tourist trade, which represents a yearly migration of more than 300 million people. These numbers can only be managed if we have an infrastructure which will be able to conserve, store and purify water. Now, we could concrete the whole beaches and construct very expensive technology which will restore this water, but I would contend, I would even demonstrate that a reed bed can do the same thing at a much lower cost. And reed beds have been doing this for centuries. So that would be, for me, would be a very good example. How do we preserve water? By using wetlands, by using traditional wetlands, and if possible, by restoring them, because most of them existed. Over the past 60 years, we lost more than half of the wetlands in the Mediterranean because of human development. And the service rendered by these wetlands to humanity are at least as important as their artificial equivalent, if not higher, at a lower cost. Now, I have the impression I'm teaching my grandmother to suck eggs because I think everybody here knows that. But you know, if you ask me for an example, that would be one.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. Let me turn to you, Patrick, because you are an investor, and you've made some very strong statement on how your organization will invest in nature. You have your own strategy. You have your own white paper, by the way. So can you explain to us, as an investor, where that motivation came from and what exactly it is concretely you do with your clients?
Thank you very much. I think it all starts with making sure you have a true conviction about where the world is going.
Yeah.
And in our case, we have made of that true conviction the paramount or the foundings of anything that we do in the field of sustainability. So we think that the world is going towards a cleaner world, towards a leaner world, towards a more inclusive world and a more circular world. And if you take those words, each and every one by one, you will be in a position to articulate what it means in terms of analyzing different industries, different companies, and then making choices as it comes to asset allocation. So my simplest way to answer your question is to say I'm sorry, I'm a finance representative. We view nature as one of the key assets that needs to be invested in, but not only to be invested in, but to be protected and harnessed in a way that it can create future revenues, not only for the investor, but for the planet in general. And if you look at that, you will probably quickly come to the realization that beyond the fact that we depend on nature for most of what we do industrially, there are fantastic new opportunities that allow us to both harness and protect nature, but also to make sure we industrially do things differently, waste less if you want. And this notion of nature today goes through proposals that will allow us to invest in regenerative types of investments. I can go into details, but also...
Can you give me an illustration of what that looks like?
Of course. If you can take the example of the water, for instance. Make sure that you have and apply new technologies to make sure that you sanitize the waters the correct way at the right place at the right moment is something that is not being done today. Otherwise, you wouldn't have so many people depending on water that comes at very heavy prices from everywhere. So that's one. The second way to look at it is to use technology as new opportunities and make sure that you can fabricate numbers of things that we fabricate today with on the basis of a bioeconomy that needs to be developed, but also to be better exploited with these new technologies.
So do you screen things differently?
We screen things completely differently. We avoid that asset becomes an expense, i.e. That this asset has been destroyed in a way that is not replaceable, and we protect that assets, making sure that we can continue to not only invest category by category, but in all asset classes for us. Meaning that you can do that in the bond market, you can do that in a private equity market, you can do that in the equity market, you can do that in many different forms, as long as you have as a target the protection of the nature assets.
And does that mean that you develop a different relationship with your investees?
Of course. It means that you have to make sure that they have a trajectory, that they have defined this trajectory, where do they want to go. Of course, you will understand that the same thing in climate, for instance, you cannot move from A to B in 10 seconds or in 1 year. And once they have defined those trajectories, that you can monitor those trajectories. So we work also with bodies that can help us come up with standards as it comes to measurability or data availability to make sure that we're on the right track. That's the way we develop the dialogue with the investee companies.
Thanks. So Simon, that gives me the cue to pass on to you. Your mantra is to make nature count on finance. That's great. So what do you do for that? And how do you help investors then to move in the right direction?
I was just listening to Patrick and thinking, if the financial sector was just made up of Patrick,
yes,
maybe we'd be in a better place. In fact, we'd definitely be in a better place. But it's not. So if everything is nature in the global economy, then finance is its sort of, human counterpart, in that it's the core of the global economy. So we can talk about many different sectors, but ultimately, if the financial sector is not aligned to nature positive flows, actually there are very few real economy sectors that will be too, for all the reasons that you've described, and we could go into more detail. So we know that sort of the bottom feeding side of it, actually bottom feeding may be not quite the right to put it, things like are things like TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. I'm not sure Tony Goldner would like me to call it bottom feeding, but never mind. In the sense that you need the data, you need to price the risk, you need to have the tools, you need to have the capabilities. All of that is true, and that work, I'm very pleased to see, is ongoing.
But if it was enough, more would do it. Sorry, I'm interrupting you.
No, you're not sorry. But
Yes.
But it's okay to
I have
interrupt. But it's okay to interrupt.
It's okay.
But clearly we know from now 10 years of measuring climate risk and pushing it into disclosure models that actually it doesn't make that much change that quickly. That actually it's a bit of a disappointment, is the truth. And so we need to make sure that it really flows into different financial instruments, asset valuation, upside opportunity analysis, and so on. And simply more information and more disclosed doesn't in and of itself make a difference. I think we have to understand that it needs to be done, but it isn't that much. And so one has to think about areas of financial innovation which aren't necessarily the ones one would immediately think about. Think about carbon markets and the interface with nature assets. They reckon 30 to 40% of all carbon offtakes in voluntary carbon markets will be associated with nature assets. But buying into carbon offsets doesn't necessarily deliver the biodiversity outcomes that we're actually interested in. In fact, quite the reverse. It can undermine biodiversity outcomes as easily as it can support investments in certain types of nature. Or if I have a chance for another couple of examples, think about sovereign debt markets, not immediately investing in regenerative agriculture, the sort of mental directness. $100 trillion worth of sovereign debt, how much of it is really linked to nature or climate? In fact, sovereign debt markets take almost no natural capital issues into account. And one can go on. So I think my message would be, the basis, the data, the disclosure and everything is important, but we need to move beyond it. And we need to think a little bit beyond purely finance as a sort of direct investment into things that we call nature assets, but think of the more complex ecosystem that makes up financial and capital markets and where nature capital does and doesn't fit into it and how we can change that picture.
Yeah, thanks. That's important. Some message here we're going to pick up on because they're not. I think that should be articulated much louder. 2 seconds to react. You wanted to react to what Simon said?
I just wanted to bring us slightly closer down to earth. Rather than looking at big consideration, the change will happen for small steps, for small one step. And I'll give you one example. In our company in Basel, we put grass on the roof. That means the building is 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees cooler. And that, it's nothing. But if every company in the world would do that, you would have nature taking on a significant part of the problems of heating and cooling of buildings.
Yeah. Thanks for making it concrete. So Louis, you also operate within the financial realm. We can see that is where there is a lot of power to drive change. But do you want to explain to us what you do with Replanet? Your aim is to increase the financial viability of ecological restoration. So you go that one step that Simon was talking about and not just offsetting and planting trees. So can you tell us what you do exactly and what that looks like in practice with an example, please?
Thanks for inviting me to this interesting, to this distinguished panel, and thanks for setting the scene, Ketel, on this. We effectively we have launched 2 initiatives actually to drive. That I would call quote unquote laboratories, ecological business laboratories, which is really to drive the business side of ecological protection and restoration. And so our aim is to bring hopefully substantial private capital into ecological restoration. Now, our basic assumption is that there is a consensus among some part of the business world, some business sectors, some financial actors, which is very important, that we need to go towards net zero and nature positive. But the instruments, the financial world, the market mechanism, the financial instruments are not there. They are only partial, they're insufficient and inefficient and opaque often. So we've tried to do really an experiment in this, and we're trying to, and we have launched those laboratories to finance ecological restoration and protection through securitization, actually. Credits, carbon credits, and biodiversity credits as well. On this journey, we face many challenges, but mainly I would exemplify 3 of them especially. The first one is valuation. The second one is tradability, investments, securitizations. And the third one, most importantly, is market governance. And so...
Just speak closer to your mic. And
sorry.
Right.
I'm not a rock star, as you have noticed.
You're doing great. You're doing great. And you apply, can you explain how your collaboratory, you apply that to mangrove restoration, just to make it concrete, also give a concrete example that we see what it looks like.
Okay. So what we do, well, first, let me explain the methodology.
Yes.
Yeah. How we have tried to answer the valuation challenge. And by the way, I was very happy to hear the Capital Coalition's announcement, because that's going to help us on a much broader scale to try to put our initiatives within a framework which is more and more accepted by the business side and the financial side. But what we have done is look at the methodology which is used to create carbon credits, try to refine it with heart in long-term science, try to monitor it on the ground, and see whether we can refine the carbon credits concept and applications. And the great thing is that one of the certification agencies has worked with us, hard, and has accepted this methodology. So we have started to do this.
Congratulations.
Thanks. The second initiative, which is even more, daring, I would say, is to take that to the biodiversity credit side. So, thank you. Not yet. So basically, with the same certification agency and second one, and with 2 years of hard work with scientists and a lot of institutions, we have tried to quantify, biodiversity, nature, as carbon is quantified. Obviously, it's much more complicated, but we think that we have built a methodology, and what we think is not important, what certification agencies think is important, because they have, at least one of them has agreed to independently use a methodology to certify biodiversity credits.
Congratulations.
Thank you. It's only one step of a long way, as André was saying. But the second step is that we have found a number of investors who contacted us from outside, because we came on the radar screen, saying, we want to invest in biodiversity credits on top of carbon credits, or even independently. So that's our answers to those challenges. The most important challenge, and I want to speak to that under the leadership of Simon as well, is governance. We think those markets are fragile and not enough governed.
Yeah.
Our answer as producer for this is, thorough science to convince participants, third-party certification, and most importantly, a policy which fairly remunerate all stakeholders in the process, not only at the time of issuance of the credits, of the carbon credits and the biodiversity credits, but at the time of retirement. So of all the revenues which will be provided, which will be created as assets.
D'accord. So concretely here in that case, you would think of smallholder farmers restoring mangrove and getting a proper income out of that function.
Yeah.
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and we have put in policies. And please notice that changes the securitization framework in which normally financial markets think. Is a kind of royalty that we want to accrue to the local communities of more of 60% of more of even the final revenue when the carbon credit or the biodiversity credit is retired is provided to the local community.
Also making it work for people and people locally.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that
and that's
all
important.
stakeholders have skin in the game.
So climate, biodiversity, and people and smallholder farmers. Thank you.
Beyond, can I add just one thing? Beyond what I said as trying to create integrity in the primary market, in the production market of this far corner of ecological restoration through private sector funding, I think we need to review totally the governance of those markets, because I do believe they are totally crucial to bring private finance to that, to really change the business sector. But the governance is lacking for the time being. So
And
I
we'll
would
get back
follow
to
the
that,
proposal of Finance for the Biodiversity Initiative in its last report.
That's great. We'll come back to that, governance being one of the pain points. Sorry, I need to let also Elisa speak. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. You are a recent graduate from our school, so we're very happy that you are. You are actually a doctor in ecology and ecological conservation, and you also have an MBA. You applying these double skill sets at SystemiQ. Working there, how do you use these skills to accompany companies to think about biodiversity and nature in their business model? What do you do concretely?
Yeah, the problems that we're facing, the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, is not a problem that one group of people can solve on its own.
Bring it higher.
Closer? Okay. So we can't leave it all to the academics, the ornithologists, or to the NGOs. That's just not enough and not realistic. And I thought instead of complaining about it, I should do something about it myself. So that's why I did the MBA after the PhD. And immediately it unlocks so much. I'll start with a little story and then I'll give you your systemic example.
Yes.
So right away, immediately, even during the MBA, so many new opportunities came by having this business mindset. I wrote a case about my NGO, which was given to MBA students at INSEAD during what they call Master Strategist Day, asking the students to look at the NGO through a new lens and see if they come up with new ideas. And oh, wow, they came up with a lot of new ideas, from video games to turning the NGO into a university, lots of amazing ideas. And a few months later, the professors kept asking me, so Elisa, is your NGO actually using any of those ideas now? And I had to say, no, sorry, no, we haven't. And it made me wonder, why actually? And the answer was quite simple. The ideas were great, that was not a problem. We were convinced they were great, they were doable, except not by the people at the NGO. They didn't have the skills and also not the motivation. What drives conservationists is being able to go snorkel with sharks every day and tag them and go catch some birds and ring them, not having to design video games there behind on their desk. So but we found a solution. Now the students who came up with those ideas are coming to do internships with us and implement their ideas. So this collaboration, it creates the new lens, the new ideas, the creativity and everything, but also you need people's motivations and people's skills to go further, basically. And so this was my little story. On a much larger scale, now at SystemiQ, SystemiQ, as the name says, it's about systems change, which means everybody needs to change, and ideally at the same time. If you try to move by yourself, you're going to get first mover disadvantage, and many things just can't be implemented or done if the whole system doesn't change at once. So one thing SystemiQ believes in very much is coalitions. We have quite a few of those. Yep. One, I'll just give the Partnership for Forest example, where we work at the same time with the private sector, the public sector, and very importantly also the local communities, and create projects that are ready for investment by making everybody work together from the start. And just in a few years, it has had a big impact. 2.2 million hectares of land now put under sustainable use, and 65 million tons of CO2 reduced through this approach. So yeah, I truly, truly believe in the importance of different sectors coming together.
Yeah, and collaboration, obviously. And I think it's interesting what you say also with MBAs going to work with conservation NGOs so that things don't get siloed, obviously. So that people can start having the conversation at the table. Let's just get the fluids running on what are the key challenges. Patrick, as was said, you're here because you believe in all this. How come more investors are not doing what you do? What stands in their way? Beyond, you mentioned your personal motivation and drive, but beyond that, what stands in the way of more investors doing more?
I don't think it was necessarily only a personal motivation. Actually, it's a professional motivation.
Yeah.
I think if the financial sector has to be driven by something, is its duty to do things correctly. And in order to do things correctly, it has to finance and irrigate the economy in a risk-aware manner and in a systemic way, which, again, takes into consideration the fact that many assets around us do simply not have any value. And if you recognize that they should have any value, then you start working with SystemiQ or other companies and experts, universities, as we do. You create science teams within the financial institutions that help you understand what is it really, because we can't go out of this scientific framework, what is really the objective to be pursued. Let me just make 2 comments on what are the challenges. One is to talk to each other. Actually, we can't, as it was mentioned, we can't do it all, and certainly not from the financial sector. We're only financiers here. We don't know the science that is behind nature, climate, and other aspects. We have to learn about it, we have to develop it, we have to encourage it, and that's what we do. We are not here to sort of establish rules and regs to protect or to constrain the development of industries or the financial sectors or the flows of capital, etc. But we have to realize that if we're talking about this today, it's because there's been some market failures. I hate to say it, but there's been some market failures. So it means that the states or the governments have to intervene. And that's where we need to be fully into these issues to somehow recommend those directions to the regulators in a correct way and not in a constraining way. And final point, I think that, talking also with those who believe it should be done quicker or it should be done differently, you name it, activist in a sense, is a very good thing.
Yeah.
It's not a negative thing.
Yeah.
But talking to each other means you have to talk in both directions. And that's why I invite also, and we do that, we have created a few years ago a platform which is called Building Bridges that is going to run its 3rd edition together with the United Nations. We are trying to get everyone around the table to explain. And the financial sector has one big difficulty, is to explain itself. The narrative that we're using to explain that we're not talking ESG, but we're talking sustainable transition, is a hugely complex issue. And that's what needs to be said.
Do you feel that investors should lobby governments for more regulation on that front?
Well, I was long enough on the other side of the fence to avoid undue regulation, so let's not fall into the trap. But I think sound self or regulation is needed in some of these aspects. It was mentioned before, we cannot look at nature separately from climate or from social issues. It's all combined. And one of the key challenges we're going to have, whether it's nature or climate, is to make sure we integrate the social aspects into it. It's an economy. We are running into an economic model where basically we have to start sharing differently. And this sharing differently, if we don't do it now, and that's where finance can help, whether it's in nature project, or whether it's climate nature related project, or whether it's a procurement project, such as the situation we're living now, it's going to create huge social tensions that will be to the detriment of each and every one of us.
Thanks, Patrick. Simon, over to you in terms of main challenges that we're facing. Do you believe in self-regulation of the entire sector to move there, to get there? If it's not just disclosure, what's the next step? Sorry, I'm going to be pushy a little bit just so that we can have discussion at the table after.
Okay, a couple of examples then.
Yeah, just closer to your mouth. That's what they told me. Yeah.
Today we can see that the oil and gas sector are making super profits out of increased energy prices, but we have a complete lack of transparency of commodity markets to see whether that's also happening in the context of increased food prices. Commodity markets are nature markets, and yet we have no real sight on how they operate and what role they're playing, particularly now, given the crisis we have in the food space. So that would be kind of one of my big interests, if you like. And actually, Switzerland, major venue for commodity markets, so an opportunity for the Swiss to take leadership in this area.
Congratulations. Yeah, I'm doing the congratulations thing.
Second example is, we know that a significant portion of nature destruction is linked to food, and we know that a significant portion of that destruction is linked to criminal activity. And yet, anti-money laundering rules, even if you have a direct sight from a financial institution on a crime that's happening at the bottom of your value chain, don't count unless those illicit financial flows are actually going through one's own balance sheet. Yeah, and so we need to bring the criminality of environmental destruction into the equation of what constitutes risk and liability for the financial community. And today, that is beginning. I think there's progress, but there's a long way to go. So I think my examples are sort of negative in a sense, but they're trying to point out big chunks of the economy, major areas where changes can be made if we are sufficiently ambitious to move on them.
Thank you, Simon. Some bold proposal here that I think will generate discussion. Elisa, can I move on to you in terms of what you think are some key challenges to scale the uptake of nature-based solution in business?
There are challenges until right up to now, but I think it's changing very rapidly, so I'll end on an optimistic and positive note. First one, I would say having targets and standards and the data to measure and monitor impact. But until very recently, now we're living in a time of complete data revolution, not just on collecting data, but also on analyzing it. So on the collecting side of things, we have satellite imagery that allows us to see elephants, individual elephants from space roaming around. We have eDNA. You just take a little scoop of water from the river, you sequence the DNA in it, and you can tell every single species in that whole river. So getting the data is getting easier and easier. Analyzing it as well with more powerful tools like AI, but also still human-based tools like citizen science, where you leverage the motivation and of humankind everywhere. And so that is shifting very, very rapidly. So I'm very optimistic.
Thanks, Elisa, for bringing this optimistic perspective. Louis, from your perspective, you mentioned governance earlier, so maybe here that's your chance to elaborate in terms of market governance. That's your strong pitch.
Sure, and thanks. Yeah, we think in what we do that governance is absolutely crucial. I mean, you've known the 2009 crisis. It's a governance crisis at the heart of the most sophisticated financial markets. I mean, the mortgage-backed securities U.S. market. It was simply non-transparent and wrong incentives. It nearly collapsed the whole world financial system. So when you create a new market, which we think is absolutely is an essential element of creating a nature regenerative business system and market economics, you absolutely need to think not only about the product, the financial asset that you're launching, that you're creating, and that would be the normal bias. I'm creating something new in the primary market, and somebody wants to buy it. Fantastic. You need to think about the whole chain of governance of where that starts and where that ends, so that all stakeholders are part of it. And I try to exemplify it. Now, but we cannot do everything. I mean, but we need total transparency on those markets, which are more complicated than many other financial markets that we know about. And we need a governance which I think will need to be taken over by supervisory authorities at some point.
Like where? Like globally, regionally?
Where, there is no overarching supervisory authority in the financial markets, but there are coalitions of supervisory authorities from the central bank side, from the from the financial markets security supervisors, and so forth. At some point, pretty soon, I think those institutions will need to be involved, and I would underline that any nature markets will need to be involved. Will need to involve themselves into that.
And these institutions right now do not have these conversations at all, would you argue? Because they have them on climate, right?
Yes, they've started. And 5 years ago, I cannot say it was a real success. So I don't come with a lot of optimism here, but I come with a sense of urgency.
Well, thanks a lot for that. André, before we have lunch, what for you are the main challenges of accelerating nature-based solution in business? so that
Well-
we get everybody starting that conversation at the table.
Yeah, thank you very much, Catel. This is obviously not the right moment because you want to eat and it's too hot.
No,
with
it's
sort of
right before they
lasting
start.
oxygen. I'm left with the last word, which is
No,
always
no.
I mean, there's going to be another conversation after you had the conversation on your table. I don't want to go into the details of what we've discussed. I've spent the last couple of days going around from session to session. There's an awful lot of thinking going
Right.
into precisely what we are talking about. How do we put a value onto nature, and how do we use this value on nature to take the right decision?
The framework seems
So
to be here even. Huh?
the framework is here. We had just a very
Right.
interesting conversation next door on the value of nature.
Right.
And for me, what I could tell you, all of you individually, is that you probably know that what we've done until now is not the right system. It
Right.
is destroying nature, and by destroying nature, we put our own health into danger, we put our own survival into danger. We are getting to the limit of the planetary boundaries, which we were talking about before. So my recommendation, and I think the reason why there are so many people who are not doing it, is because they think it's not cool. You know, we're all engineers. We want technology. We want nice models. We want sort of shiny things. And yet, you know what? Nature can do most of that work, but we have to be humble enough to accept, to listen to what nature is telling us, and we have to be sufficiently brave and bold to sort of industrialize, if I can put it that way, the strength of nature. So I think that one of the major obstacles to introducing nature-based solutions is that people are scared of being seen as weak. We are in a society which is strong, and you dominate because you are strong. So you dominate nature, and now nature is not sort of
Do you
doing
think
what
we
we
have
say.
the wrong narrative on nature?
I think we have the wrong narrative. We think we really have to say that nature is something we live with, it's something we live, we can help to regenerate, we can live from. So the idea of protecting nature to live with it is much better than trying to develop against it. So really, my recommendation is bold and courageous. Go for it, because it is worth it, and don't sort of discard it because it's not technological.
Yeah, thanks so much, André. So a round of applause for our experts. You have a well-deserved lunch, so if you can pick up the conversation in your table. The idea is still to discuss the same topic. Again, we want to hear from you in terms of what are these pain points, what can help. And after you'll have this conversation, we'll ask one of you if you can have maybe one rapporteur from a table, someone who can speak up the conversation, or I ask randomly. We'll bring them back to share your conversations and what you've identified as some of these pain points and possibly some of the solutions that we haven't, accelerating factor that we haven't discussed here with our experts. With this, bon appétit.
Thanks. Hey, question to Louis. Replanet, this certification method that you were mentioning, what are you using? You said that you're working with one, but what is it, and is there something new that we all should know about it?
Yeah, people were asking how do we scale this also in other conversation in the table.
Sure. Thank you for the question. I'll answer it a bit as an economist, and then maybe Isabel can answer it more as one of our science colleagues. But the answer is, I mean, for carbon, you know how you certify carbon, right? You define, how much carbon you sequester through nature, whatever. And you can compare that from region to region in the world. That's actually scientifically, even for a layman like me, it's pretty simple. Biodiversity is much more complex, as we know. I mean, quantifying nature is mind-boggling. But think of it, and what we think we have created with a group of scientists is a methodology which is applicable to the 1,300 ecosystems which have been classified by the World Wildlife Fund according to biodiversity metrics, place by place, and based on those metrics, you can create a scale of biodiversity upscale, especially when you compare with the pristine, with another site, which would be your reference site in terms of biodiversity richness or wealth. Think of it simply as an index like we use very much in finance and in economics, like the inflation index. I mean, we compare and we trade currencies based on the inflation index in South Africa, Switzerland, UK, and Argentina. Well, the basket of goods that you use are the basket of goods which are proportionally consumed in those countries by the majority of the population. They're totally different from one country to the other. Still, we take the percentage and we compare and we trade. That's what we're trying to create. Well, that's what we have created. And Plan Vivo, the agency, seems to have agreed with us that it's a feasible methodology. Now, maybe, Isabel, you want to say something more about as an example?
Yes, here.
Thanks. I think you probably covered most of it. But I think the thing that's interesting is this idea that for carbon, we have 1 ton of carbon, and we know what that is, and it's got different values according to how it's packaged. But we don't have this 1 unit of biodiversity. And so what the methodology that we've co-created does is that it quantifies the uplift of biodiversity by 1% uplift equals 1 credit. So it's super easy to understand. And finally, we're able to sort of trade that in a similar architecture to carbon. So, we're not yet at the certification level, but we've had a huge amount of interest from businesses who are sort of anticipating the future biodiversity market in the same way as we're seeing it for the carbon market. And I just want to add that one of the main things that we need to be careful in the creation of a new market is its integrity. And really crucial to that is how we're remunerating the host countries or the people that actually live around these sites that we're rewilding or restoring. And so our concept at Replanet, and that we really think that everyone should be doing, is that 60% of any profits that are made from these credits return to the host communities. And that is by no means what most credits do. So we really feel that that's very important. And if you want to know more about the actual specifics of the methodology, the different baskets of metrics that go into this measurement, it's openly available. The methodology is not closed, it's open sourced, and we really want as many people as possible to pick it up and sort of make it more of a reality.
Thanks so much, Isabel. And just one additional question quickly on that, and then I'll let you react. So you say we have different metrics for diversity compared to climate, but they're also very localized. There'll be, so that adds to the complexity, correct? Can you speak just a second about that?
So for biodiversity, you obviously it's not 1.5 degrees like we've got with climate. It's much more specific than that. So this methodology has different metrics for each of the different ecoregions around the world. So we would expect 5 different metrics at a minimum for each site, and that can be defined by the people developing the site and then externally verified and validated by the credit rating agency, so Plan Vivo, and we're also talking to the other big agencies that are doing that.
Thank you so much, Isabel. So it's not because it's complicated that it's impossible. And of course, it's more complex, but it's not impossible. Here is an example. You wanted to add something, Simon.
I was just going to add to Louise and Isabel's point that one needs to take these leading examples, and there are others, and one needs to ask, how can one prevent that being gamed out by everybody else? So Respira International, carbon trader based out of the UK, has an embedded profit-sharing agreement with nature asset owners or stewards that, they figured out how they translate through multiple trades, because, of course, it's not just the initial trade. They've got to run it through the entire liquid market that offtake may be traded to. So the question is, how do you make sure that the markets can't accept any trades that don't have profit shares? Then we're beginning to get into what Louise in the earlier session talked about in terms of governance. So I think the point about certification is, if I might say, there are lots of folks very obsessed with certification, and at one level that's good and right, and we need to innovate in the area, but certification and governance is not the same thing, and we need a way to think about the governance of markets, of which certification is one piece. We could have voluntary carbon markets in the future where the ton is perfectly measured and it's really helpfully destructive of the planet. And that has to do with the way markets are governed, not only the product is specified. Thanks.
Thanks, go ahead.
Hi, Irina, working on innovation for blue carbon. Thank you for wonderful discussion, and it is great to speak to people who already in the forefront of carbon markets. But when we do our customer development, of course, we meet corporations that are very enlightened and understand and have teams that distinguish low-quality projects from high-quality projects. But we meet a lot of skepticism, people not believing in offsets, especially SMEs, and people being skeptical, or people just being really afraid of nature-based solutions specifically, because once in a while there is an expose about some conservation project and it's more damaging for the reputation than. And the question is, how do you deal, like, do you meet a lot of skepticism still in your work, and how do you deal with that?
Thanks, very important. It goes back to some piece on the narrative. Maybe, André, you wanted to pick that up. And then maybe I can ask you also, Elisa, to react to that. How do you do when you meet that skepticism?
I just want to underline an absolute fallacy, and Irina and I had a conversation of discussing that before. Carbon trading is not a solution to the problem. Carbon trading is only concentrating on the CO2 emission, and that is not going to be enough to change the way we produce goods and services on the planet. So biodiversity credit, which are going to take into risk the loss of biodiversity, seem to me to be much more appropriate. So the first thing I would say is that carbon credit is a fantastic way of transferring money from the rich north to the poor south, and we should use it as much as possible, but it's not going to be the solution.
And I would probably add.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
The question was on the skepticism, and then let me pin this. If you have an answer to that, maybe, because you meet a lot of clients. Simon, please behave in my panel. Elisa, I'm gonna come back. Elisa, over to you.
Yes, so to prevent or overcome skepticism, you need to prove your impact, and you need to show how you spend every single dollar or euro that you have, which requires a whole lot of effort, a whole lot of data collection, a whole lot of data analysis and publication. And how do you fund that? Where do you get the human capacity to do that? And for NGOs in particular, it's a very, very heavy job, and it's being requested of NGOs more and more, but they're not helped in that process, I would say, not financially and not with human capacity support. So yes, if they want it, they should also help with it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, thanks for that. Just to pin that conversation we just started on the relationship between what we're talking about and the climate conversation, because I've heard that conversation also around the table. Is one way to accelerate nature-based solution to connect all these narrative to climate change? Is that the way, or should that be a separate conversation? Is that one way to accelerate? Because climate change has been picked up by every company. As I said, everybody has a strategy on that. What's your view, all of you, on that? Because I think that's, I've heard that. You can. So now it's good. Yeah, no mic.
So there was this big argument before TNFD was created as to whether TNFD should be task force on nature-related.
Thank you.
Sorry, Catel. Whether TNFD should be integrated into TCFD. Yeah, so that we had a single place. So big debate. You can imagine how many people
yes,
have
I can imagine
about this topic. And the good news is it wasn't integrated. Yeah, and that's because if you slave the nature conversation into what is anyway actually largely a carbon-based view of climate, i.e. not a resilience-based view of climate,
okay.
Then what happens is you get a narrower picture as to what the role and the stewardship responsibilities we have are over nature. It becomes what historically was called a carbon stick.
Yep.
Yeah, and we think about nature as a carbon stick, and that's not going to deliver a thriving biodiversity that serves many, many different uses. So I would say the relationship between climate and nature is hugely important.
Yes.
Yeah, and we need to focus on it in many respects. We mustn't ever slave the nature agenda into the climate agenda.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, because we hear a lot of that. Yes. And you're next, I know.
Yeah, in some ways following on from that. So first question my question is, do we actually really know what the best nature-based solutions are that we should be accelerating at scale? We've had a few examples, but if we were really to do this at scale, would we not be in danger of risking unintended consequences across the people, nature and climate dimensions? And if it is the case that we don't, at this point in time, fully know what the solutions might be, should we not be designing a framework that embraces that uncertainty and that looks to how we can accelerate solutions at the same time as acquiring new knowledge and modifying the approach as we go along?
And when you speak about unintended consequences, is it for people or for biodiversity itself?
For people, for biodiversity, and or for climate.
Excellent question.
I think the question gives the answer. What I was trying to say in my original remarks about what is nature-based solution, it's very much about a new attitude towards humanity and nature. So it's not an idea of saying, I find a product and then I push it. It's I find a new relationship, a new contract between nature and humanity. And that implies a framework which will allow us to use nature in a reasonable way and for nature to be able to help us in a reasonable way. So your question is exquisitely phrased, and it's exactly how I would say it. We need a new framework.
Let's dig a little bit deeper into that, because that's fundamental. If we're talking about a market approach to it or an investor approach to it, then we run that risk. So any other views on that in terms of how far you can go with using the market approach? Yeah.
Let me give you just a view of a primary market operator in that field, in the far corner of that field. I mean, one of the main reasons that we have created Replanet and start with carbon credits is because this market is existing. It's insufficient in terms of governance, fully agreed, and we're really trying to show as a primary operator that we can transform this governance leading by example. But we need authorities as well and thought leadership on this. But we also created it to test it and create next to it, parallel to it, with it, the biodiversity credit, because that is the transforming market for us, for the planet, I think. And we would review all our projects on the basis of what is the benefit for climate, to carbon capture, and what is the benefit for biodiversity. I mean, and we would not imagine, as Simon would mention, that we would ever embark on a project which would be detrimental to biodiversity. And we can think of many examples how that would be possible while capturing carbon. Now, do we need a new framework? Yes, we do. That goes mainly for me through market governance. Do we need, and so the answer to your question is yes, but I don't feel enough sense of emergency when I talk to authorities, companies, and so forth. It's urgent.
Yeah. Elisa, you wanted to react to that?
Yes,
yeah?
I would like to answer to the question differently. I think ultimately you can't go shopping for nature-based solutions like in the supermarket. There is not many of them. There is one solution, and it is nature. It works as a whole.
That's nicely phrased.
You can't say I need trees for oxygen or I need mangroves to prevent erosion. If you want the mangroves, then you need the creatures that will spread the seeds of the mangrove trees. If you want those creatures, you need the water they live in to remain below a certain temperature. If you want that water to remain below a certain temperature, you need to stop climate change. If you want to stop climate change, I'm going to stop here. You get the general idea. So yeah, one solution, and it's nature. Switch it around.
So Simon, is this whole concept of nature-based solution then problematic in a sense? Sorry, I'm breaking down the whole panel, focus of this panel, but I think that's an important point. Right.
So can I answer the question differently?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, you may.
Unintended consequences, to your point, right? Because the world is full of them. So, the EU says we're going to impose on businesses in Europe a requirement to report on deforestation, new due diligence mechanism. UK pushing the same story. Then the EU announces that actually it may ban the import of soya and beef that leads to significant deforestation, particularly in Brazil. Brazil says, hang on a minute, just explain to me how this works. We used to call this a non-tariff trade barrier. Yeah, are you restricting our exports based on what you think I don't need to carry on that conversation. So I take your point. There's one solution called nature, and in theory, people are part of nature, or in practice. But clearly, we can't pretend that there aren't trade-offs. Yeah, so this is perhaps a little less to do with unintended consequences. Can I give one more example? So I, along with perhaps many other people in this room, certainly many others, are very busy pushing the global financial community to integrate nature risk into financial decision making. TNFD and or NGFS and all the usual acronyms apply. So what's the effect of that? Well, the effect of that is that it will significantly change the pricing of food assets, and it will put potentially tens if not hundreds of millions of people out of work. And certainly in the short term, and the short term can go on for a long time, it will significantly increase the price of nutrition. So these are real effects. These are not just simple technocratic fixes. We already know that integrating climate risk into sovereign debt instruments has led to a dramatic increase in the cost of capital for the world's poorest climate vulnerable countries. We're about to see the same thing happen in the nature space. So I think your point is absolutely well taken, and it's to do with social choice. We have real social choice issues to deal with about how we deal with trade-offs, how we manage payoffs where trade-offs are unacceptable. This isn't a technocratic fixed nature problem, or at least we won't be able to fix it in that way.
Thanks, Simon. You've been patient.
Yeah, thank you. So it's Fabio, Sofia. It's for Simon again. Sorry to ask you again, but you were saying that the sovereign debt markets actually don't include any things about nature. Can you provide a few examples of a mechanism that financial markets could, in the short term, integrate to unlock that market? Do you have a few examples to provide us?
So in the context of the emerging market debt crisis, which of course is huge and getting worse every day, there's quite a lot of discussion for the first time breaking out in the context of a debt restructuring conversation about where climate and nature might fit into that. Now, there's a history of, some of you again may be involved in it, of debt for nature swaps, which tend to have been small scale. We'll cut your debt if you treat the white rhino in the right way. I'm oversimplifying to make the point. They're small, ad hoc, expensive to negotiate, not liquid, can't be repeated. Interesting past, but definitely not the future. And now there's a different conversation beginning to emerge in what one would call the sort of KPI-linked sovereign debt space, where one's linking nature and debt performance outcomes to the cost of capital directly. And if those nature effects, back to the productivity story that we were getting earlier, if those positive nature effects in fact feed back into productivity and resilience, then in fact that isn't only a reduction in the cost of capital of that particular piece of debt associated with that instrument, but it begins to affect the sovereign risk pricing of the country as a whole. So clearly, when one talks to S&P and many others, natural capital is either underpriced or just not priced. It's a little bit of a variation in sovereign debt markets. Clearly, there's a new generation of instruments that certainly FB, but also others are trying to push in the context of the current sovereign debt crisis, and at the same time, working with the IMF, working with the rating agencies and others to try and embed, if you like, natural capital as a risk pricing element into the broader infrastructure of markets. I think this is doable, first of all. This is not a mañana story. The first KPI-linked sovereign debt instrument at scale was launched about 6 weeks ago by Chile. Sustainability-linked sovereign debt, $2.1 billion, 3 times oversubscribed. I think we're going to see a whole new generation of innovations as nature sort of comes to sovereign debt markets. And I hope it doesn't require saying, but I'll say it for fun, that although direct project lending is hugely important, and we tend to think about finance and nature in that context, sovereign debt markets are how nations fund their fiscal space and how many, many things function in practice. So if we don't get this into capital markets as well as lending, we're only playing a side game. So the capital market story is really, really important, of which sovereign debt markets are a big piece.
Thank you. Do these examples reassure you in terms of unintended consequences? Right? Because this is pushing the example quite far. So What's your reaction? Tell me more. Because I can see you crossing your arms. And
I'm not deliberately cutting my arms. I mean, I think so. There are, I guess, two different elements to this. I mean, in answer to my question, you were talking about trade-offs. Those are where we know and there are irreconcilable differences, and we've just got to choose between what we prioritize and what we prioritize, and that requires a social conversation to decide what as a global community we want to prioritize. There's an additional set of considerations where it's actually current lack of knowledge. We don't actually know what the outcomes are, and so I guess that's a different dimension still, and where if we're putting together a response that genuinely accelerates as fast as possible to a goal that we might all have aspired to in terms of living more harmoniously with nature, then we might want to think about the framework that we're putting in place such that we are adapting and evolving that framework as we acquire new knowledge, and that indeed we, at the same time as accelerating the solutions, we also accelerate the acquisition of that new knowledge, so that we are, really taking as evidence-based approach to this as we can.
Totally right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think another one for you, Simon. Sorry, or anybody actually. Yes. We talked about biodiversity credits, and now you mentioned also about bringing natural capital into capital markets. Is it the same metrics we need to support project finance and capital markets to actually really bring natural capital into those equations?
That's a geeky question. Can I give a short answer just so we don't bore everybody? But I think it's a really important question. So I think most of us plural abstract, have focused our understanding of KPI metrics as being impact metrics, and most project financing, we think about it in those terms. So it's sort of akin to a sort of impact investing mindset. Actually, in the sovereign debt markets, we want impact, but actually, if it's only impact, then it doesn't feed back and train sovereign debt markets to take natural capital into account, because it's just seen as an end of pipeline public goods outcome that somehow one's buying into. So we need a more complex set of KPI metrics that include impact and feedback into the dashboard of debt traders in the shape of not nature outcomes or impacts, but in the shape of risk pricing. So it's a sort of another level of complexity in the way those KPIs need to be built, not straightforward.
Yes, so we're going to park that. No more technical question. Go talk to Simon afterwards, because I didn't understand the last piece. Thank you. We've talked about market mechanisms. We talked about market products. We talked about investment and also the role of finance here. There is a growing conversation, and we've heard some bits and pieces of conversation here about using the law to accelerate nature-based solution on the protection of nature in general. There is a movement on ecocide, right? You've all heard about that. Earlier, Simon, you were also talking about how to integrate nature in anti-money laundering, for instance. So can you all give me your sense of how you think that can help in pushing that agenda? André, can I start with you?
So I think that in the debate which we are trying, maybe it's worth taking one step back. Why are we talking about nature-based solution? Why are we trying to harness the power of investment to have an impact on our planet? It's because the opposite is true, and we need to correct, and we need to create incentives. Now, if we want to bring all potential solutions to the problem of the loss of nature, we can. There's an important aspect to do with financial systems, and that's why we talk about this today. But there's also a governance issue. Do we want to elect governments who are going to take nature as a platform? And there is, of course, one of the three powers. There is the whole law element. Yeah. And we know for a fact that pollution and overusing of natural resources is stealing substance from the next generation. So it could be considered a crime. I think the last WHO statistic is that something just lower than 20 million people a year die from air pollution. So it's not just theft, it's also murder. And the fact that we do not qualify that, the fact that we do not define it, and the fact that we do not use the collective brain powers of all the courts of the planet to bring something to that is, I think, a wasted opportunity. So in this battle to trying to explore different ways of changing the way we deal with our planet, I think there's a role to play.
Thank you, André. And important for the narrative piece as well. Louis?
Yeah, building on what André said really rapidly, it's, I think, a clearer nature value legal aspect, including from the criminality side, will actually feed into what I was proposing before, like Simon, on markets governance. I mean, nature markets needs governance. I'm a broken record on that. But if you have a pollution law which is much clearer and much stronger in terms of valuing nature as a public good which has to be conserved, that will actually feed into the governance of how you invest into nature and how you create financial instruments to do it. So I see the two as really complementary and feeding on each other.
Thanks. Elisa?
Maybe what I would add is that when you put laws in place, they are absolutely necessary, but there's two ways you can put them in place. You can put them in place from a human perspective, which we've heard now, so anthropocentric view, preserving nature to fix our market failures, etc. Or you can put them in place recognizing an intrinsic value of nature independent from human perception or need or value. And sometimes they can even solve problems between different views of humans. So a good example is in New Zealand, where one of the main rivers of New Zealand, it was a big fight between, on the one hand, the government, which wanted to use it, turn it into a protected area, but used for recreation purposes, so ultimately for humans, and the Maori people of New Zealand, the native people of New Zealand, who wanted to protect the river for spiritual reasons and hence didn't want it to be used by tourists for rafting, etc. So two different views, but both still from a human perspective, and the solution was to recognize human rights to the river. So now the river is seen as it's an independent entity that has the same rights as a human. So this intrinsic view of the river fixed the opposing views of two different groups.
Elisa just published a piece about that today. You can check it on the Intent website where it's really nicely articulated. Simon?
Yeah.
I know you have a view on that.
So I wanted to really reinforce this pattern that's emerging in so-called legal personhood of nature. Yeah, it was very marginal. It was sort of PP'd as, oh, this is just Bolivia and Ecuador, and it's just a political play. Actually, it's super interesting. It's really super interesting because it takes a very different view of how one understands the application of regulation. So I just want to kind of re-emphasize the point. I think it's fascinating. I'm going to take just a slightly different one, if I may. So I've already mentioned nature crimes and financial institutions. Today, the regulatory environment is that if I'm a financial institution and I'm indirectly benefiting or directly benefiting from the fact that whatever I'm investing in is acquiring low-cost ecosystem services by taking advantage of nature crimes, I have no liability.
Yeah.
And that is simply not okay. It's just not okay. And it has to be resolved, and it can't be resolved with the current infrastructure of anti-money laundering rules, but it can be resolved by changing them. And there's a whole lot of work in that space. And so that's a really big deal when you look at the fact that, without naming names, if you're investing in the world's largest meat company that happens to be in Brazil, we know that they are benefiting from illegally acquired low-cost ecosystem services, and probably if there are any financial institutions in this room at scale, they're probably investing in JBS.
Yep.
And that's just not okay.
Yep.
Yeah, so there are big chunks of this regulatory agenda that need to be taken on. I don't think everything has to be regulated. Patrick's not here to say
yes,
his piece.
I feel bad because now everybody's nodding.
But if he was here, since we talked about it a bit over what do you call it, lunch, over lunch, then his point was, you can't continuously regulate, but yes, financial institutions need to demonstrate that they have no nature crimes in their financing value chain. It's just black and white on this.
Agreed. Okay, now we have to wrap up. There are already all lines are blinking.
No, but just to say, the consequence of what we're talking about, the fact that we are trying to create transparency for standards, is carries in its own consequence the fact that there will be an awful lot of court cases coming. So if I was an investor, I'd be worried.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. We're going to have to wrap up. But, so I'm going to ask you, because we are supposed to leave people with one thing. I think you're leaving all of us with a lot of ideas. But now, as we all go back to our jobs in different organizations, for me in a school, for some in an NGO, for others in governments and financial institutions, what's the one suggestion? I'm going to start with you, Simon. Short, huh? One suggestion, one recommendation you'd give all of us to push on the job when we get back.
So I'm going to take the unintended consequence model. So I'm going to go, there isn't a silver bullet. We've got to experiment with a lot of things.
Yes.
And we mustn't get locked into one set of solitary standards that seem to make sense today. So I'll just stick with that.
Thank you. So and that also means we can all do something, by the way. Elisa?
I'd say go outside, look at the beautiful, beautiful mountains, and picture them covered in factories, shopping malls, and more horrific things, up to you. And then think what that means about what you have to do.
Thank you, Elisa. Oui.
Simple. Tackle your future business by design, not by disaster.
Oh, nice one. Someone has prepared. I like it. André, you have the final word.
Well, I'm trying to make it even shorter. Just do the right thing.
Thank you. André, Louis, Elisa, Simon, thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today.